Hello again, class. This will be our third and last lecture on George Washington's presidency. In our previous lectures, we discussed the creation of the first cabinet. We discussed Alexander Hamilton's economic plan, part of which was the assumption of state debt after the Revolutionary War, which led to a compromise that put the capital of the new nation in Washington, D.C. Today, we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk, one, about the Whiskey Rebellion. Two, we're going to talk about George Washington's farewell address, the advice he gave the nation when he left office after his second term. And we're going to talk about the formation of political parties. So let's talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. Part of Hamilton's economic plan included a tax on whiskey. Remember, Hamilton was trying to figure out a way to pay off the war debt, and he wanted the national government to pay off the state's debts. But to do that, you needed money, and part of his plan included import taxes, but another part was to tax whiskey. In 1794, Pennsylvania farmers were unhappy with this. They made lots of money from selling the grain that is used to make whiskey. There's a couple different reasons for this. One is, it's hard. Remember, this was before you had trucks. This was even before you had trains. So to get your goods to market, to get your goods someplace you can sell them, you basically had to, put them in a wagon and have the wagon drawn by horses. Well, grain, if you just cut the grain from the field and stack it up in a wagon, it's going to take up a lot of room. But if you can distill it down to a liquid form, you can transport a lot more of that grain in the form of whiskey on a wagon. And so farmers would often turn their grain into whiskey because basically you had more content in a smaller volume. It's more dense, so to speak. So it was profitable. Whiskey was profitable for a lot of farmers. And these farmers were unhappy that they were being told that the federal government was going to tax their whiskey. So they started what's called the Whiskey Rebellion. They attacked tax collectors, and hopefully this will remind you of the colonist response after the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act. But at this point, the country had going on a 30-year history of attacking tax collectors when they didn't want to pay a tax. So the Pennsylvania farmers did this. They also threatened to attack Pittsburgh. Well, Washington wasn't going to let this stand. So he raised a 13,000 soldier army, basically a really big militia, and which ended up destroying the rebellion. Now Washington, he didn't actually participate in fighting. Quite frankly, there really wasn't any fighting. Once the army showed up, the farmers basically said, "Oh, yeah, never mind. We'll pay the tax. Don't worry." But Washington became the first and the only president to actually, hop on a horse and lead an army, not really into a battle, but at least towards a battle. Now, all presidents are commander-in-chief of the military, but they mostly give orders to the general. But since Washington was the most experienced general around at the time, he actually put together the army and led it for part of the way towards the Pennsylvania farmers and revolt. So, what about that whole no taxation without representation thing? Didn't we fight a war with Britain to get rid of taxation without representation? And the answer is, well, yes, we did, but the Whiskey Rebellion is not taxation without representation. After all, who writes the laws? The legislative branch. Remember, L for legislature, L for laws. It is the legislature branch that ultimately wrote the whiskey tax, and They are made up of elected officials. Right? People in Pennsylvania, these farmers got to vote on who the representatives were. And so Washington and the federal government's response was like, wait a minute, this isn't taxation without representation. Right? We didn't fight a war to eliminate all taxes forever. The point of the Revolutionary War was that you can't tax someone who doesn't get to vote on the people issuing the taxes. But after the Constitution, the people in America are in fact getting to vote on the people who write their taxes. Therefore, Washington and the federal government found the whiskey tax to be very much different than the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, because the colonies didn't get to elect members of Parliament. But again, people in America, including these Pennsylvania farmers, they were allowed to vote on the members of Congress who were issuing taxes in the 1790s. All right, so yes, this is taxation, but it is with representation this time, not without, and that's an important distinction. All right, so why am I telling you about the Whiskey Rebellion, this very brief failed rebellion way back in 1794? Couple things. It proved the federal government had the right to issue taxes. After all, the members of Congress, George Washington, these were elected officials. And since they were elected, they were allowed to issue taxes. The Constitution specifically says it. It says the legislative branch of America can issue taxes. And so the Whiskey Rebellion sort of shows that. It's like, look, the Constitution gave the government certain powers, and one of those is the power to issue taxes. And two, it shows the federal government could and would enforce its laws. So not only, it's one thing to write something down on a piece of paper. All right, you have to pay a tax on whiskey. But for anyone to actually pay that tax, you have to be able to enforce that law. And the Whiskey Rebellion showed that this new government created by the Constitution was in fact able to do so and willing to do so. So how does the Whiskey Rebellion compare to Shays' Rebellion? Remember, Shays' Rebellion took place under the Articles of Confederation. A lot of farmers and former Revolutionary War veterans were unhappy with their economic problems. And so they started attacking, Massachusetts courts and armories and that sort of thing. And what did the federal government do with respect to Shays' Rebellion? Well, nothing. Because the national government under the Articles of Confederation had no executive branch. They had no way to enforce their laws. All right, this was purely a Massachusetts problem. But the Whiskey Rebellion shows how things have changed between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Now that there's a Constitution, the country has a president and who can raise an army and who can lead an army into battle to enforce the laws. So now the national government, not only does it specifically have the power to issue taxes, but it has an executive branch to enforce its laws. So the Whiskey Rebellion, which takes place basically within about 10 years of Shays' Rebellion, really shows how much different the two governments are under the Constitution as compared to the Articles of Confederation. It shows that the Constitution has now created a federal government that is strong enough to act. Not only can it not only can it pass laws, it can enforce them as well. Okay? So there's probably no one event during the early part of the country that shows this difference, how the country and the government has changed after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. All right, so I told you in probably our first lecture on Washington that one of the things Washington is most known for is retiring. He said 2 terms is enough. I've served 8 years, it's someone else's term. And so after 8 years, he does retire. He doesn't. He makes it known that he will not serve a 3rd term, so he's not running for office. But before leaving office, he wrote a farewell address. He basically issued he wrote a sort of a letter to the country, in effect, where he gave some advice to the country. He had 2 pieces of advice that we remember from the farewell address. 1, avoid permanent alliances in Europe and stay neutral in European fights. So Washington was saying, look, throughout the 1700s, European countries, France, Britain, Spain, they were constantly at war with one another. We talked about this some before, the French and Indian War, and then how France and Spain were eager to help out America during America's Revolutionary War. These countries, along with other European countries, were constantly fighting each other. And Washington, advised the countries, like, look, we have enough problems just trying to create a new type of government, trying to create this new country from scratch. We can't be drawn in to a bunch of wars in Europe. Right? When he's writing this letter, there's not even a permanent army in the U.S. There's probably a permanent navy, but it's very, very small. And so Washington says, look, we're too weak to go try to conquer Europe. We just need to focus on creating our country, starting our own country. All right, so he said, stay out of European wars. And this is going to be somewhat controversial for some of his successors, because there are going to be times where parts of the country are going to suggest that America go to war with, say, France or Britain. But Washington's one of them, don't get involved in European affairs. It's just, they're on one side of the ocean, let them handle their business on that side of the ocean, we'll handle our business on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. And for the most part, for 120 years or so, the country followed Washington's advice. We certainly don't anymore, but up until the time of World War I, we generally followed Washington's advice, and we stayed out of European wars. Washington's second piece of advice, however, is going to be ignored, and quite frankly, it was being ignored even by the time he wrote it. Right? Washington said, don't form political parties. All right? Don't do it. Political parties just exist to fight each other instead of solving problems. That was his view. All right, and I'm not going to comment, but I'll let you make your own decisions whether you believe that's an accurate representation or prediction of how political parties will operate. But that was Washington's view. All right, that political parties were bad for the country, and that we should avoid them at all costs. So what happens next? America forms political parties, of course. And ironically, well, before I talk about the irony here, let's just, for those of you who may not know, let's define what a political party is. It's a group of people, they typically tend to be, agree with each other on a lot of various issues, and they work together to try to win elections and to run the government and to influence other people's opinions. Again, members of a political party, they won't agree with each other on all issues, but they tend to be pretty like-minded on many of the big issues, the big political issues of the day. That's what a political party is. Now, ironically, the first political parties in this country were created out of Washington's own cabinet. All right, so if you remember, the members of his cabinet, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph. All right, and it's the disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson that lead the first political parties. All right, remember we talked about how Jefferson opposed Hamilton's idea of a national bank. We talked about how Jefferson and Madison opposed Hamilton's idea for the federal government to assume or to take over the state's debts at the end of the Revolutionary War. So these disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson are really going to be planting the seed for the political parties. All right. So Hamilton and his supporters became known as Federalists. All right, remember, so this is the same name as the group of people who supported ratification of the Constitution. Now, it gets very confusing because the people who wanted to ratify the Constitution, they weren't necessarily a political party. They were just people who agreed with that one idea that the Constitution should be ratified. Okay? And as we're going to see, some people who were Federalists back in the 1780s, when you're dealing with ratification of the Constitution, are going to be on the opposite side. I'm thinking of James Madison. He's not going to be a Federalist when these political parties are formed in the 1790s. But Hamilton and his supporters become known as Federalists. Jefferson and his supporters, including James Madison that I just mentioned, are going to be known as Democratic Republicans. So these are the first two political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Sometimes Jefferson's party will sometimes just be referred to as Republicans, but that gets confusing because there's a Republican Party now, but it is not the same party that Jefferson started. So we'll always talk about them as the Democratic Republicans. Now, generally, and again, all of these are generalizations because you can always find exceptions to things, but generally speaking, Federalists wanted a bigger and stronger federal government. In that respect, they were similar to the old Federalists during the debate on the ratification of the Constitution, because remember that group thought the Constitution was necessary because they thought the country needed a stronger government that would take some of the power away from the states and put it in the national government so that could actually operate and function. All right. To remember the Federalists, just think about the 3 F's. Federalists favor a strong federal government. All right, the 3 F's: Federalists favor federal government. Okay? Those are the Federalists. Democratic Republicans, in contrast, wanted a smaller, weaker federal government. All right, so who are some of the famous Federalists? Obviously, Alexander Hamilton, he's the first Treasury Secretary. John Adams, the second President of the U.S. And then a guy we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to talk about quite a bit more during these series of lectures on the early republic, John Marshall. He's going to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's going to keep that job for, I believe it's 34 years. I know it's more than 3 decades. He's going to be one of, if not the most important, Supreme Court Chief Justices in history. He's going to write a lot of important opinions. And he was a Federalist. So what do the Federalists believe in? And who were they? Well, they're more likely to live in cities. They typically favor a stronger national or federal government. After all, Federalists favor federal government. They, certainly at least talking about the national bank debate, they favor a looser interpretation of the Constitution. Again, they favor the national bank. Again, we're going to keep talking about this national bank quite a bit. They favored protective tariffs. You remember, protective tariffs help grow industry. They help grow your own manufacturing. A lot of these were in the north. They were closer to big cities, and so Federalists who lived in the cities tended to favor protective tariffs because they were hoping to grow manufacturing industry. Thus, they wanted an economy that was mainly based on manufacturing and trade. Okay? These are the Federalists. Now, again, these are generalizations. You know, I'm not saying every single Federalist in the country lived in the city. They didn't. And that there were no Democratic Republicans who lived in cities. Of course there were. But these are generalizations, and so they were generally true. All right, so let's talk about the Democratic Republicans. Their more famous members, basically the 3rd, 4th, and 5th presidents. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Now, again, Madison's kind of an interesting figure because, you know, when you talk about ratification of the Constitution, he was a Federalist. He did favor a type of federal government as established in the Constitution. However, once the federal government is put into place, he then becomes much more protective of states' powers, of agricultural issues, that sort of thing. He's basically Thomas Jefferson's protege. Thomas Jefferson's like his mentor. And so he follows Jefferson into the Democratic Republicans Party. And then finally, James Monroe, who, like Jefferson and Madison, from the Virginia planting class, very agricultural in scope, and he's going to be another Democratic Republican. All right, so who are the Democratic Republicans and what did they believe in? Well, as you might have guessed, they tended to live on farms. They favored weaker national government and that more power should be kept in the states. They, especially when we're talking about the national bank debate, they favored a strict interpretation of the Constitution. And again, and one reason they favor such a strict Constitution or strict interpretation is because the Constitution is pretty short. And so if you think that the federal government can really only do those very specific and exact things listed in the Constitution, well, then the federal government's not going to have very much power. So they favor a strict interpretation. They oppose the national bank. They oppose protective tariffs because protective tariffs tended to hurt agricultural groups for two reasons. One, because they didn't make their own clothing or goods. They had to buy them from Europe, and tariffs raised the price. They didn't like those. And also, tariffs tend to lead other countries to put tariffs on your goods, and so the South was wanting to sell a lot of its goods in Europe, or I'm sorry, its plants, its crops in Europe, and protective tariffs made that less likely to happen. And finally, as I've been talking about really consistently when we talk about the Democratic Republicans, they wanted an economy based more on agriculture. Okay? So these are the general differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Again, notice you're talking about people who favor agriculture versus people who favor manufacturing. As we know, the South was very, very much based on agriculture, the North not as much. So you see these political parties, you see that there is a geographic divide. Once again, I'm foreshadowing, issues that are going to eventually lead to civil war. And now it's still, 60 or 70 years away at this point. But you see these beginnings of these what we call sectional differences, regional differences in different sections of the country. And you can see them in these very first formation of the political parties. Okay, that's the end of our discussion of George Washington. On the next lecture, we will turn to the second president, John